Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. There's a phrase tattooed on Ryan Holiday's right forearm. 3 words. Ego is the enemy. He put it there after a period in his late 20s when, by every outward measure, his career was accelerating in ways that should have felt like triumph. He had dropped out of college at 19 to apprentice under Robert Greene, the author of the 48 Laws of Power. By his mid-20s, he was the director of marketing at American Apparel, one of the most talked-about brands in the country. He had published books, built a consulting firm, advised celebrities and best-selling authors, developed a public profile as one of the sharper young thinkers in media. He was, in the language of contemporary ambition culture, crushing it. And then, in the span of a few months, much of it came apart. The company where he'd built his reputation collapsed in scandal. A relationship with a mentor he'd organized his professional identity around fractured beyond repair. A business he'd built began tearing itself to pieces. And in the quiet of that wreckage, Holiday found himself looking honestly at something he had been successfully avoiding the whole time things were going well. The degree to which his ego, not his talent, not his circumstances, not anyone else's failure, had been quietly undermining everything he was building. He had already been researching a book about ego when the collapse happened. The experience turned it personal in a way research alone couldn't have produced. He finished the book, and he tattooed the title on his arm, not as a reminder of his failure, but as a daily reckoning. A promise to himself to keep looking at the thing that his culture and his industry and his own ambition were constantly conspiring to help him avoid looking at. Ego is the Enemy was published in 2016. It became an immediate bestseller, found a devoted following among athletes, military leaders, entrepreneurs, and people navigating any kind of high-stakes ambition. The Seattle Seahawks made it required reading. Olympic athletes and CEOs listed it among the books that changed how they operated. And if that sounds ironic, a book about the dangers of ego becoming a status symbol, a book about avoiding self-promotion becoming a platform for the author's brand, then you are already ahead of the most interesting critique we'll work through later. But first, the book itself. Because before we can honestly assess what it gets wrong, we have to understand, fully and in depth, what it actually says. And what it says, at its best, is genuinely important. Part 1. What ego actually is, and why it's not what you think. Holiday opens the book with a careful definition. Because the word ego has been stretched across so many usages that it risks meaning nothing. He is explicit that he is not using it in the Freudian sense, the ego as the mediating structure between the ID's impulses and the superego's constraints, the rider trying to manage the horse. He's also not using it in the purely clinical sense of the egotist as a personality-disordered individual who lacks empathy. He's using it in the ordinary, widely understood sense that people gesture at when they say someone has a big ego. An unhealthy belief in one's own importance. Arrogance. Self-centered ambition. The part of you that needs to be recognized, needs to be right, needs to be the most important person in the room. The petulant child, as he calls it, the one who chooses getting their way over anything or anyone else, who prioritizes their own comfort and status over the actual work. Who confuses the appearance of greatness with greatness itself. This definition matters because it immediately separates ego from confidence. Holiday is careful about this distinction throughout the book because it is the most common objection to his argument. Won't suppressing ego make you timid, uncertain, easy to push around? His answer is no, and his reasoning is precise. Confidence is earned. It is grounded in actual competence, actual achievement, actual honest assessment of your abilities and limitations. Ego is borrowed. It is a claim to status and importance that outpaces the evidence. Confidence says, I've done this enough times to know I can do it. Ego says, I deserve to succeed because I'm the kind of person who deserves to succeed. One is a realistic reading of demonstrated ability. The other is a fantasy layered over an unexamined sense of entitlement. The gap between confidence and ego is also the gap between what you can actually do and what you tell yourself and others you can do. And Holiday's central observation, the one that gives the book its structure, is that this gap, when it exists, produces different problems at different stages of a life. When you're aspiring towards something you haven't yet achieved, Ego whispers that you don't need to do the work because you're already the kind of person who will succeed. When you're succeeding, ego tells you that the success proves everything you believed about yourself and that you've earned the right to stop learning and start just being admired. When you're failing, ego prevents you from seeing the failure clearly, extracting its lessons, and doing what recovery actually requires. 3 stages. 3 specific forms of damage. 1 source. This is the architecture of the book. Aspire, success, failure. And in each, ego is the enemy. Part 2. The painful prologue. Why this book exists. Before entering the 3-part structure, Holiday shares something that gives the whole project its emotional credibility. A partial account of his own reckoning. He was, he says, not an innocent bystander watching ego destroy other people. He was a participant. His own ego had been running quietly alongside his ambition, feeding on his early successes, telling him stories about his own exceptionalism that he was too busy winning to question. He describes, somewhat obliquely, with some details withheld, a period in which several things he'd built or relied on collapsed simultaneously. He mentions a public humiliation by someone he admired that was so destabilizing he ended up in the emergency room. He mentions a moment of such complete loss of confidence that he walked into his boss's office and told him he couldn't cut it and was going back to school. He mentions a book signing where one person showed up. He mentions his company tearing itself apart. What he learned from this is something the book is partly an attempt to articulate, that the ego doesn't just get in your way when you're arrogant and insufferable. It gets in your way in subtler forms that are much harder to recognize because they wear the costume of virtue. The relentless self-promotion that looks like passion. The inability to take feedback that looks like having standards. The obsessive need to be understood and credited that looks like caring about the work. The fantasy of the future self that substitutes for doing the actual present work. These are ego in disguise. And they are, in some ways, more dangerous than obvious arrogance because they're harder to catch. Holiday eventually had the phrase tattooed on his forearm, a daily confrontation with the thing most likely to be his undoing. Not as punishment, not as self-flagellation, as a reminder to look, every day, at the enemy that never goes away, that is always reforming, always finding new disguises, always finding new ways to whisper that this time it's not ego. This time it's justified. This time you really are as good as you think you are. Part 3. Aspire. The ego of the beginner. The first section of the book is about aspiration, the stage at which you are working towards something you haven't yet achieved. A career you're building, a skill you're developing, a goal you're pursuing. And Holiday's opening observation about ego at this stage is one that people immediately recognize but rarely want to admit about themselves. We love to talk about what we're going to do more than we love to actually do it. He introduces one of the book's most memorable formulations in the very first chapter of Part 1, talk, talk, talk. He cites research on what psychologists call substitution, the phenomenon in which telling someone about your goal produces some of the same psychological satisfaction as achieving it, without requiring any of the actual work. When you announce your ambitions, post them on social media, tell your friends, frame your grand plans in vivid detail over dinner, you get a hit of the recognition and validation that the achievement itself would have brought. And because you've gotten a hit without doing the work, you have slightly less motivation to do the work. The social performance of ambition partially substitutes for the actual pursuit of it. This is the ego's first move against the aspiring person. Get them to talk so they feel like they're doing. To confuse the performance of purpose with the actual substance of it. Holiday opens this chapter with a striking piece of historical evidence. Upton Sinclair, the muckraking author of The Jungle, once ran for governor of California on a progressive platform and wrote a book imagining what his governorship would look like before the election. The book was a bestseller. The campaign was a catastrophe. He lost by 10 percentage points. What happened? He had, in his vividly organized imagination, already lived out the experience of being governor. He had already gotten the psychological reward. Why bother with the messy, uncertain, grinding work of actually winning? The prescription Holiday offers is disarmingly simple and enormously difficult. Be quiet and work. Not quiet because modesty is a virtue in itself. Quiet because talk drains the energy that work requires. Quiet because the gap between what you say and what you do is where your credibility lives and dies. Quiet because the work itself is the point, the actual making, doing, learning, building, and every hour spent performing it is an hour not spent on it. Talk less. Work more. This is not a new idea. But Holiday's framing of why it matters, the specific mechanism by which talk sabotages aspiration, makes it feel fresh and urgent. Part 4. TOB or TO-do. The question that defines everything. One of the central questions in the aspiration section comes from a military strategist named John Boyd. And it is one of the most quietly devastating questions in the entire book. Boyd was a fighter pilot and defense intellectual who developed the ODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, a decision-making framework that has influenced military strategy, business thinking, and sports coaching for decades. He was brilliant, combative, and passed over for promotion repeatedly because of his refusal to play the military's social politics. He had a question he used to ask people, especially young people at the beginning of their careers. He'd take them aside and ask, "Do you want to be somebody or do you want to do something?" These are not the same question. They seem like they should be, but they're not. Being somebody means acquiring status, recognition, position, title, the markers that tell the world and yourself that you've made it. Doing something means producing work, solving problems, creating value, the actual substance that the markers are supposed to represent. The tragedy Boyd observed, and that Holiday uses him to articulate, is that when you choose being somebody as your primary goal, you systematically undermine your ability to do something. Because being somebody requires protecting your position, avoiding risks that might damage your image, avoiding criticism, managing perceptions, maintaining the narrative of your success. All of which are the enemies of the work that genuine achievement requires. Boyd himself, Holiday notes, chose to do. He passed up promotions, declined assignments that would have advanced his career but moved him away from the work he believed mattered, and died relatively obscure in his own time while his ideas went on to reshape military doctrine. He made the choice that ego makes almost impossible to make and stayed true to it his entire career. Holiday connects this to a distinction that runs throughout the book: purpose versus passion. He is critical of the contemporary culture of passion, the advice to follow your passion, to do what you love, to let the intensity of your feeling about something be your compass. His critique is precise. Passion is self-referential. It is about the intensity of your own feeling, about how much you want something, about the story you are telling yourself about your relationship to a goal or a dream. Purpose is other-directed. It is about something outside yourself, a problem worth solving, a contribution worth making, a person or community worth serving. Passion asks, "How does this feel for me?" Purpose asks, "What does this serve beyond me?" And Holiday argues that the people who do work that actually matters are almost always driven by purpose rather than passion, even when they can't articulate the difference. Part 5. Becoming a student. Humility is the most powerful tool. One of the most practically important sections of the aspiration part of the book is on what Holiday calls becoming a student, and specifically on maintaining the genuine student's posture of openness, learning, and accurate self-assessment even when you think you already know. He tells the story of Kirk Hammett, the lead guitarist of Metallica. Hammett was already a highly regarded guitarist when he joined Metallica in 1983. He was 20 years old, technically accomplished, on his way to becoming part of one of the most successful bands in history. And at that moment, with every reason to feel like he'd arrived, he sought out Joe Satriani, one of the most technically advanced guitarists alive, and asked to be taught. Not for a masterclass. Not for a quick session. For sustained, rigorous instruction. He showed up as a student, set aside his own established approach, and let himself be remade as a musician. The Metallica albums that followed contained some of the most technically demanding and emotionally complex guitar work in heavy metal history. The instruction didn't diminish Hammett. It transformed him. And Holiday uses the story to make a point that seems obvious and is almost universally ignored. The moment you believe you've graduated from student to expert is the moment you start getting worse. Because improvement requires accurate feedback, and accurate feedback requires genuine openness to the possibility that you're wrong, that you have blind spots, that there is someone who knows something you don't know. Ego closes that openness. It replaces honest assessment with defensive certainty. And defensive certainty stops learning cold. He goes further and identifies what he calls the pretense of knowledge as the most dangerous form ego takes in the learning stage. It is more dangerous than obvious arrogance because it is so much harder to identify in yourself. The person who is obviously arrogant usually knows they're arrogant. The person who operates from the pretense of knowledge, who has absorbed enough information to feel confident and has confused that feeling with actual competence, is genuinely unaware of the gap. They are, in Richard Feynman's formulation, fooling themselves. And as Feynman noted, you are the easiest person to fool. The prescription is what Holiday calls updating your appraisal of your own talents in a downward direction, which is, he acknowledges, one of the most difficult things any human being can do. Our self-assessments are systematically inflated. We remember our successes more vividly than our failures. We attribute our wins to skill and our losses to bad luck. We calibrate our self-image against the average rather than against the genuine standard of excellence in our domain. And the practice of honest downward revision, of looking at yourself as you actually are, not as you wish to be seen, is the beginning of the kind of growth that ego makes impossible. Part 6. The Canvas Strategy. Helping others as the most effective form of self-advancement. This is one of the most original and most counterintuitive ideas in the book, and the one that tends to most challenge the instincts of ambitious people. Holiday calls it the Canvas Strategy, and it is built on a paradox. In the early stages of any career or aspiration, the most effective thing you can do for yourself is to make yourself useful to others without requiring credit or recognition. The image is from the metaphor of a painter and the canvas, a young artist who, instead of demanding their own canvas, helps stretch and prepare the canvases of more established painters. Not because they lack ambition, not because they accept a permanent position of service, but because in the process of working in proximity to excellence, learning its rhythms and standards and demands, they absorb something that no amount of working alone on their own projects could produce as quickly. Holiday tells the story of Benjamin Franklin's early career in print shops, how he arrived in Philadelphia essentially as a runaway, attached himself to established printers, made himself indispensable, and used that position not just to survive but to observe and absorb the craft of printing, the world of ideas, the social infrastructure of the city's intellectual community. He was not imposing himself on those spaces. He was serving them. And in serving them, he was building the foundation for everything that came later. The ego resists this posture intensely. The ego says, I should be recognized now, based on what I know I could produce if given the chance. I shouldn't have to do grunt work. I shouldn't have to help someone else build their vision before I build my own. The ego confuses working in service of others with being servile, with accepting a permanent condition of subordination. But Holiday's point is sharper than this. The Canvas Strategy is not about self-abnegation. It is about the most efficient possible use of the aspiration phase. The person who spends their early years accumulating genuine skill, genuine relationships, and genuine understanding of how excellent work is actually produced, through proximity and service rather than through premature self-promotion, is in a fundamentally stronger position when the opportunity for genuine expression arrives. The practical application is something like this. Look for ways to make other people's work better without requiring credit. Identify the gaps and inefficiencies and problems in the environment you're part of and solve them quietly because you see them and because solving them is useful, not because you'll be recognized. Introduce people who should know each other. Find what nobody else wants to do and do it well. Produce more than anyone expects and give credit away freely. This is not martyrdom. It is strategic positioning dressed in the clothing of genuine service. And it works, paradoxically, because the ego's demand for immediate recognition is what prevents most ambitious people from doing it. Part 7, Restraint, Sobriety, and the Danger of Early Pride. Threaded through the entire aspiration section is a recurring warning about pride, specifically early pride. the premature satisfaction that comes from a first success or a first recognition, and that, if indulged, makes the next level of growth impossible. Holiday uses the concept of sobriety in a specific and non-literal sense. Sobriety, for him, means the ability to see yourself and your situation with accuracy, without the distortions of either false modesty or inflated self-regard. The sober person is neither crushed by failure nor intoxicated by success. They receive both with the equanimity that comes from having their assessment of their own work grounded in the work itself rather than in the reactions of others. He contrasts this with what he calls the disease of me, a phrase he borrows from basketball coach Pat Riley, who used it to describe the dynamic in championship teams where individual players begin to prioritize their own statistics, recognition, and contract negotiations over the team's collective performance. The team that wins a championship together and then individually contracts the disease of me typically falls apart trying to defend the title. Because the same selflessness that produced the championship, the willingness of each player to subordinate their individual ego to the collective goal, is undermined the moment success validates the egos that were previously disciplined. This is, Holiday observes, one of the most reliable patterns in the history of human achievement. The qualities that produce early success, hunger, work ethic, genuine openness to learning, willingness to serve the work rather than the self, are exactly the qualities that success most reliably erodes. Because success provides evidence for the ego's narrative. It says, "You were right about yourself. You're special. You deserve this." And the discipline that produced the success gets replaced by the entitlement that success generates. Which is why the hardest part of success, for most people, is what comes immediately after it. Part 8. Success. The most dangerous stage. Holiday has a formulation in the success section that is both simple and genuinely sobering. Success is not a test you pass once. It is a condition you have to maintain daily against forces that are constantly working to undermine it. And the most powerful of those forces is not competition from outside. It is the ego that success itself creates. He opens part 2 with a story about Katharine Graham, the publisher who took over the Washington Post after her husband Phil's suicide and built it into one of the most important newspapers in American history. Overseeing Woodward and Bernstein's Watergate coverage, fighting the Nixon administration's attempt to suppress the Pentagon Papers, and transforming a family newspaper into a national institution. She was, by any measure, one of the most consequential figures in American journalism of the 20th century. And yet Graham spent most of her early tenure as publisher convinced that she was out of her depth. She had no formal training in journalism or business management. She had been a housewife before the role was thrust upon her. She second-guessed herself constantly, deferred to men around her who were less capable than she was, and only gradually developed the confidence that her actual performance justified. What Holiday finds remarkable about this story is not the insecurity, but what the insecurity produced. Graham's genuine uncertainty made her a ruthless listener, a perpetual student, a person who sought out the best available wisdom rather than relying on her own judgment, because she honestly believed her judgment was fallible. And that posture, produced by a kind of enforced humility, made her more effective than the confident, self-assured executives around her who had no reason to keep learning. He contrasts Graham with the more common pattern of people who achieve genuine success and immediately begin protecting it through ego rather than continuing to earn it through work. The success that should be a platform for more and better work becomes instead a thing to be defended, explained, and leveraged for status. The person who is hungry and learning becomes the person who is satisfied and performing. And the performance, however polished, is not the same as the real thing. Part 9. Managing yourself. The challenge ego makes impossible. One of the most practically valuable sections in the success part of the book is about self-management, specifically the challenge of running yourself as you would run a well-functioning organization. With honest accounting, clear-eyed assessment of performance, and genuine willingness to identify and address failure. Holiday draws on the story of Angela Merkel, the German chancellor who became one of the most effective political leaders in modern European history. Merkel, he notes, was almost entirely uninterested in the performative dimensions of political leadership. She did not cultivate an iconic persona, did not deliver theatrical speeches, was not a media figure in the way that most successful politicians feel compelled to become. She was, by the standards of contemporary politics, boring. What she was not boring about was governing. She was obsessively focused on understanding problems, accurately assessing situations, and making decisions based on evidence rather than ideology or self-image. She had, Holiday suggests, achieved the remarkable condition of someone who cares about the outcomes of their work more than about the perception of their work. He connects this to a concept he calls sobriety in the success phase, which is not the same as the sobriety of the aspiration phase, though it shares the root meaning of accurate seeing. Success phase sobriety means the ability to keep asking, even after you've achieved, whether what you're doing is actually working. To maintain the honest accounting that hunger compels in the aspiration phase, even when success has removed the external pressure for it. To keep reading the feedback that reality provides, even when reality's feedback contradicts your preferred narrative about yourself. This requires something that ego makes almost impossible: the willingness to be wrong about things that matter to you, especially things whose rightness your identity has come to depend on. The executive who has publicly committed to a strategy, who has staked their reputation on a direction, who has made the bet and told the world they've made it, that executive faces an ego-driven barrier to changing course that has nothing to do with the quality of the evidence. The ego has fused with the position. Changing the position feels like being wrong, and being wrong feels like being worthless, so the position must be defended regardless of what the evidence says. And the organization suffers for it. Part 10. Entitlement, Control, and Paranoia. The trilogy of ego and power. Holiday identifies 3 specific forms that ego takes in people who have achieved significant success and are now operating from positions of power. And he calls them the trilogy of ego's destruction: entitlement, control, and paranoia. Entitlement is the belief that success has earned you special treatment, that the rules and constraints and normal obligations that apply to others don't fully apply to you. Holiday uses the example of General George McClellan, the Union general during the Civil War who was given command of the Army of the Potomac despite being genuinely talented, and then proceeded to squander it through a combination of inflated self-assessment and paralytic caution. McClellan believed, sincerely and in detail, that his own genius was so extraordinary that the normal standards of military performance didn't quite apply to him. He couldn't be measured by wins and losses. He was above that. He was building something larger. In the meantime, he didn't fight. Lincoln removed him twice. Control is the ego's response to the anxiety that success creates, the recognition that you now have something to lose, that failure is possible, that the gap between your self-image and your actual performance might at some point become undeniable. The controlling leader is one who has responded to this anxiety by trying to manage every variable, suppress every source of unpredictability, eliminate every challenge to their authority. They micromanage not because it produces better outcomes, it almost never does, but because the appearance of total control soothes the ego's terror of being wrong. Paranoia is what happens when the controlling impulse meets the reality that it cannot fully control anything. The leader who has tied their identity to being right begins to see every challenge to their decisions as a personal attack. Every dissenting voice becomes a threat. Every failure of the plan becomes evidence of someone else's sabotage rather than the plan's inadequacy. Holiday uses the example of Howard Hughes in the later years of his life, the aviation pioneer who ended his days barricaded in hotel rooms, terrified of germs, surrounded by sycophants, convinced that everyone around him was conspiring against him. A man whose extraordinary talent had been so thoroughly fused with an extraordinary ego that when the ego lost contact with reality, the talent went with it. Part 11. Failure. The stage ego makes most dangerous. The final section of the book is about failure, which Holiday argues is not the exception to a well-constructed life, but the predictable, inevitable, necessary part of any life of genuine ambition. You will fail. The question is not whether. The question is whether the ego will let you survive it, learn from it, and return to the work. He opens this section with a concept he calls alive time versus dead time, borrowed from the writer Robert Greene. Dead time is time spent waiting. Time spent in passive resentment of circumstances, in bitterness about what happened, in the comfortable luxury of victimhood that allows you to feel justified in not doing anything. Alive time is time spent learning, preparing, doing whatever is actually available to you in your current circumstances, even when those circumstances are profoundly constrained. He uses the example of Malcolm X's prison years as his most striking illustration of this concept. Malcolm X was imprisoned for burglary in 1946 at the age of 20. He spent 6 years in Massachusetts prisons. He could have used those 6 years as dead time, festering, waiting, letting the years drain away while resentment built. Instead, he enrolled in a correspondence school, read voraciously in the prison library, taught himself to debate, converted to the Nation of Islam, and found a framework of purpose that gave his anger direction, and emerged from prison a transformed person. He used years that could have been the end of anything as the beginning of everything. He turned his constraint into a canvas. The ego, Holiday argues, is what makes dead time feel justified. The ego says, "I didn't deserve this. This was done to me. I shouldn't have to work in these conditions or with these limitations. I deserve better than this situation allows." And as long as that voice runs, the available time is dead time. The work that is possible, the growth that is available, the preparation that could be happening, none of it happens because the ego is too busy demanding circumstances it doesn't have. Part 12. Draw the lines. Maintain your standards. The final chapters of the failure section address what Holiday calls maintaining your standards, specifically the distinction between the objective standard of excellence you hold yourself to and the external markers of success that the ego confuses with that standard. He uses the story of the New England Patriots under Bill Belichick as his central modern example. The Patriots had, by the period Holiday was writing about, accumulated an almost unprecedented record of sustained excellence, multiple Super Bowl championships across more than a decade, produced with different rosters, different schemes, different cast members each year. What remained constant was the standard, not the goal of winning, that was taken for granted. The standard of how each player prepared, communicated, made decisions, and executed within the system. Belichick famously told new players, "Dear job. Not your ego's job. Not the job you think you deserve. The actual job assigned to you, executed at the highest possible level." The ego confuses the standard with the outcome. It measures success by whether you won, whether you were recognized, whether the result matched your self-image. The standard Holiday is describing measures success by whether you performed at the highest level you're capable of, regardless of whether the result was what you wanted. And the person who holds themselves to a standard rather than to an outcome is paradoxically more resilient in failure because failure doesn't contradict their identity the same way. They can look honestly at a loss and ask, "Did I meet my standard?" And if yes, the failure is simply the result, which is not always within your control. And if no, there's work to do. He also addresses the concept of meditate on the immensity, which is the practice of deliberately confronting your own smallness in the scheme of things as a way of putting the ego's dramas in proportion, not as self-abnegation, not as a denial of the importance of your own work, but as the recognition that you are one person in one moment in an inconceivably vast and ancient universe, and that the intensity with which your ego insists on its own centrality is not matched by anything in the actual structure of reality. This perspective, held honestly and without denial, doesn't diminish the work. It frees the work from the weight of being the ego's primary project, and in doing so, allows it to be better than it would otherwise be. Part 13. The Endless Loop. Aspire, Success, Failure. Repeat. Holiday closes the book with an observation that is both humbling and clarifying. The 3 stages are not a progression you move through once. They are a loop you cycle through indefinitely, for as long as you are genuinely alive and genuinely engaged with anything that matters. Every success creates new aspirations. Every aspiration contains the seeds of future failure. Every failure, survived and learned from, generates new aspiration. You are never permanently successful. You are never permanently failing. You are always in motion, always in one of the 3 stages, always facing the same enemy in a new form. And the enemy, the ego, doesn't retire. It doesn't get weaker as you get older or more experienced or more successful. If anything, success strengthens it because success provides evidence for its claims. The more you achieve, the more plausible the ego's story becomes, and the more dangerous it is. The seasoned executive is no more immune to ego's damage than the 23-year-old starting their first job. The forms are different. The damage is equally real. Holiday ends with something that is almost confessional. He says he wrote the book not because he had conquered his own ego, but because he hadn't. Because he keeps finding it in new forms, in new disguises, in the spaces he has not yet looked carefully enough. Because the tattoo on his forearm is a reminder he still needs every day. And because the book he wanted to read at every critical turning point in his own life, the book that told him honestly, and without sentimentality, that the enemy was already inside, didn't exist. Until he wrote it. The critique, where ego is the enemy, contradicts itself, oversimplifies, and earns honest scrutiny now. Here is where we get honest. And I want to spend real time here, because the critique of this book is more interesting than the standard complaints about self-help books, and it cuts in some unexpected directions. Let's start with the one that is sitting in the room the entire time you're reading. The most obvious, the most irresistible, and in some ways the most important critique of ego is the enemy is this. The book is a masterpiece of self-promotion by a man with a very large platform, publishing under the brand of a philosophy that warns against self-promotion, platform building, and the disease of me. And not only is the irony visible, Holiday is apparently visible about it himself, acknowledging it in interviews, but it actually gets at something true about the book that the irony only points toward. Holiday had, at the time of this book's publication, a substantial and carefully managed public brand. He was not the quiet, unglamorous craftsman putting in the work without seeking credit that the book's philosophy most admires. He was a best-selling author with a newsletter, a podcast, a consulting practice, a bookstore, a social media presence, and a talent for generating press coverage that dated back to his days as a media strategist who manufactured controversies for clients. The Ryan Holiday that exists as a public entity is, among other things, a very effective piece of marketing. And ego is the enemy, which cautions against the pursuit of recognition and the performance of ambition, is also a vehicle for recognition and a performance of a certain kind of intellectual ambition. This is not a fatal critique. Great books are sometimes written by people who embody the contradictions they describe. Seneca's Wealth, as we discussed in the Daily Stoic Summary, is the classical version of this problem. The message can be true even if the messenger doesn't fully embody it. And Holiday, to his credit, seems aware of this gap in himself, in a way that many self-help authors are not. But the awareness, while honest, doesn't resolve the tension. It just makes it visible. Second, and more substantive, the book's treatment of ego versus confidence, while useful as a practical distinction, is philosophically shakier than it appears. Holiday insists that ego is the enemy of genuine confidence, that real confidence is earned through work and honest self-assessment, while ego is a counterfeit version that outpaces the evidence. This is a real distinction and worth making. But the book tends to treat ego as an essentially negative force with no legitimate function, which is both psychologically inaccurate and practically misleading. The research on self-enhancement, the tendency to overestimate your own abilities and prospects, consistently shows that some degree of positive self-illusion is adaptive. People with accurate or slightly negative self-assessments are often less likely to attempt difficult things because they more clearly see the likelihood of failure. A modest degree of overconfidence, of believing in yourself slightly beyond what the evidence strictly justifies, turns out to be associated with greater persistence, greater willingness to take risks, and greater likelihood of achieving ambitious goals. The person who attempts things they're not yet fully qualified for is sometimes exactly the person who eventually becomes qualified. The ego that says, "I can do this," ahead of the evidence isn't always wrong. Sometimes it is the engine that generates the very evidence it was prematurely claiming. Holiday acknowledges this when he distinguishes confidence from ego, but the line he draws in practice is fuzzier than the clean distinction suggests. Throughout the book, The examples of ego's damage are vivid and well-chosen. The examples of what appropriate confidence looks like, confidence that doesn't cross into ego, are less fully developed. The reader is left with a clear picture of what not to be, and a somewhat less clear picture of what to be instead. Third, the book's historical examples are consistently compelling and consistently partial. Holiday uses history the way a skilled prosecutor uses evidence, selecting the most illustrative cases for his argument, presenting them in their most argument-supporting form, and largely declining to engage with the counterexamples. The successful people he profiles who demonstrate ego-free humility are real, and their stories are accurately rendered as far as they go. But the selection is not representative. For every William Sherman, who achieved legendary military success through patient, self-effacing work, there is a George Patton, who achieved comparable success through ego-fueled audacity and public self-promotion. For every Katharine Graham, whose enforced humility made her more effective, there is a Steve Jobs, whose documented arrogance and contempt for others' limitations appears to have been genuinely instrumental in some of his most important achievements. For every story of ego's destruction, there is a counter-narrative in which the relentless, self-aggrandizing conviction of one's own importance produced results that more modest people would not have attempted and therefore would not have achieved. Holiday is not unaware of the Jobs counterexample. He addresses it briefly, noting that Jobs was ultimately a more nuanced figure than the mythology suggests, that the most valuable things he built depended on collaboration, and that his most famous failures were at least partly driven by exactly the ego-fueled blindness the book describes. This is fair, but the engagement is brief, and the selection of examples throughout consistently tilts toward cases that support the argument rather than cases that complicate it. The result is a book that feels more conclusive than the full historical record supports. Fourth, the concept of purpose over passion, which is one of the book's most original and most important ideas, is presented with a confidence that outpaces its development. Holiday argues compellingly that passion is self-referential and that purpose is more stable and more meaningful because it points towards something outside the self. But he doesn't fully grapple with how difficult it is to find genuine purpose, or with the way that what presents itself as purpose can often be, on examination, a refined form of ego in disguise. The person who has convinced themselves they are driven by purpose rather than passion, who has organized their self-image around being motivated by service rather than recognition, has not
necessarily escaped ego.
They may have simply dressed it in more sophisticated clothing. The desire to be the kind of person who is driven by purpose rather than passion is itself a form of ego. And the discomfort of examining whether your apparent purpose is really about something other than you is something the book raises, but doesn't fully sit with. Fifth, the failure section of the book, which is thematically the most important, the section where the philosophy is most tested, is paradoxically the thinnest in terms of practical guidance. Holiday is excellent at diagnosing what ego does in failure. It prevents honest accounting, it manufactures excuses, it turns setbacks into somebody else's fault. It makes dead time out of what could be alive time. What he is less complete about is what the non-ego response to failure actually looks, feels, and sounds like in the experience of the person going through it. Failure is not only a philosophical problem. It is a psychological event with emotional dimensions that the Stoic framework, however valuable, doesn't fully address. Grief is real. Shame is real. The demoralization that comes from genuine loss of something you worked hard for, something that mattered, is a real psychological experience that requires more than reframing and returning to the work. For people dealing with the psychological aftermath of serious failure, the instruction to get back to work can function as a dismissal of legitimate suffering rather than as a path through it. The book treats the psychological dimensions of failure as primarily cognitive, as a matter of accurate thinking that ego distorts, without giving adequate weight to the emotional processing that genuine recovery requires. And finally, the critique that is perhaps most worth making because it applies to the entire genre Holiday writes within, not just to this book. The advice is calibrated for high achievers whose primary obstacle is themselves. The implicit reader of this book is someone with genuine talent, genuine ambition, meaningful resources of time and opportunity. and an ego that is getting in the way of using those things most effectively. For that reader, and there are many of them, the book is genuinely useful and genuinely honest. But the world contains many people whose obstacles are not primarily internal. People whose ambitions are constrained by circumstances that are not of their making. People for whom the problem is not that their ego is preventing them from doing the work, but that the work they do is not recognized or rewarded because of structural barriers that have nothing to do with the quality of their character. For those people, the instruction to be humble, to do the work without seeking recognition, to embrace the canvas strategy and subsume your identity into the service of others, this advice, however well-intentioned, can function as a prescription for accepting exactly the conditions that are limiting them. Telling a marginalized person to suppress their self-assertion and trust that the work will speak for itself, in a world that is not always fair or accurate about recognizing work on its merits, is very different from telling a privileged young man at a talent management agency to be less aggressive about self-promotion. The book doesn't acknowledge this tension. It presents its philosophy as universal in a way that it isn't quite. And that gap, between the universality of the claim and the specificity of the audience the philosophy was developed for, is worth naming clearly. Final thoughts. Let's end where the book itself does, with the recognition that the fight against ego is not a battle you win once and then rest from. It is a daily practice, imperfect and ongoing, that begins again every morning with the same question: are you here to be somebody, or are you here to do something? This question, Boyd's question, is the most clarifying thing in the book, because it cuts through all the complexity of ambition and career and achievement and asks you to look honestly at your own motivations. Not the ones you'd like to have, but the ones that are actually running you. And that honest looking, however uncomfortable, is where improvement of any kind begins. Holiday is not a saint. He is not the perfect practitioner of what he preaches. He is a writer and thinker who found something worth thinking about, the way ego quietly poisons the work of building a meaningful life, and wrote about it as clearly and as urgently as he could. That the book has its own contradictions and limitations is not a reason to dismiss it. It is a reason to read it carefully, to hold its ideas at the appropriate distance, to take what is true and useful and apply it to your own situation rather than swallowing the whole thing whole. The enemy it describes is real. The phrase tattooed on the author's forearm is honestly earned. And the question it keeps asking, are you working on the thing, or are you working on the appearance of working on the thing, is one that deserves an honest answer every day for the rest of your working life.